TNKR Media.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
It's the Goldwaters. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar, and I'm here with Dr. Samantha. How are you, Dr. Sam?
I'm doing great, Dan. How about you?
Great, thank you. We're just coming off the end of the March break here. Perhaps a chance to reflect, to have one last push before the end of the school year. What are your thoughts on the state of education? And maybe we could use this opportunity on how to make a push for better grades or better results. What do you think, Samantha? How do we optimize learning?
I think that's a really big question because learning comes at home and in terms of our, societally, how we value learning, and particularly for teens in terms of their peer groups, what's considered acceptable or quote, cool. Maybe I'm too old to use the term even cool anymore. And in terms of the actual education system itself, how we teach kids within schools. I think that I think there's been a big push over the years in terms of standardization of education and standardized exams. I think that those moves are important to be sure that across schools there's something similar being taught and kids can come out with similar skill sets. But along with that, I find that there's been sometimes a bit more of an emphasis of teaching towards the test. Because that's often how schools are measured in terms of their success teaching kids. I think that sort of narrow view of education and really focusing on grades and teaching only the skills that are being measured in the test, I think can be problematic. It's something that we should guard a little bit against, because I think that schooling overall is, we're looking to teach also general values. We're looking to teach things that are really important what's important to learning isn't always the individual facts. So we want to be teaching and encouraging as parents and as teachers in school. We want to be teaching grit, or the term that's been going around for a little while now is a growth mindset. If you want to look it up and find some really practical tools for teaching it. We want to teach perseverance, curiosity, interest, basic social skills, and cooperation. And I think all of those things, whatever facts that we're teaching kids, we want to really focus on those broader values. Because I don't know about you, Dan. I think there was that program that was, I think it's been canceled since, but it was Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? And I think it was really humbling for a lot of adults to watch this, because a lot of times we're watching this and, we're watching these, grade fivers sort of ace through these questions and we're scratching our heads looking confused. And I have a PhD, and some of the facts that they were presenting, I was like, I don't know what these kids are brilliant. I don't know what they're talking about here. And I think that's part of the point. A lot of the facts it took me a long time to realize this. A lot of the facts that we learn in school, we don't necessarily maintain. And some of them are important, some not so much. The main function of school, and to a certain extent of parents, is to teach kids how to learn. And I think that that's really where we want to put our emphasis. So as parents, when we're talking to kids, we want to focus on not necessarily what their grades are, but can they persevere despite obstacles? What do they find? How can they create interest in this for themselves? How could they be curious and explore the topics more? And I think that teaching towards those values rather than just the facts is really what's going to help help the next generation.
So you think we're a long way away from outsourcing our education, our higher learning to, YouTube and online platforms and the do-it-yourself model?
I think the do-it-yourself model has a place. And I'm really glad that there's more podcasts and YouTube videos and online courses being offered, because I think it gives access to education to people that wouldn't necessarily have it. And even for those that have it, it gives them more time to be able to, explore these topics in their free time. And I think that's really fantastic, particularly for people that are more, economically disadvantaged. Do I think that should replace the traditional model in terms of actually having a teacher and a class where you can interact and ask questions and discuss? No. I think it's an important add-on.
Let's get to the conversation with Samantha, Daniel, and Anne France. How to learn on the Goldwaters.
All right, Mom, Daniel, we're in the March break period. We're just wrapping it up. We're wrapping up spring break now. And so this is kind of a pause before we have the one final push into the end of the year, or the last semester of the term for school. So let's kick off the discussion with our best student, Mommy. Do you think kids could be learning more effectively? Are we over-testing kids? And is it time to revise conventional or sort of traditional learning and teaching? What do you think?
Well, isn't that funny? Many, many long years ago, my psychoanalyst said, when we were having a discussion about the historical values of pedagogy, that the concept of public schooling in the United States started specifically to permit parents to work. Children had to go somewhere. So the primary function of the public school system was essentially to babysit children. That's the first thing. The second thing that I learned growing up is that the primary function of the public school system is to socialize children. And I used to fight against that, and I considered that left-wing hocus pocus, because I felt that the primary obligation of the public school system was to educate children. And I fought against this all my academic life, at least until law school, where things, of course, were different.
It's interesting because I have a very mixed feelings when it comes to teaching towards tests and teaching towards, skill building. Is, part of it is a lot of my training and doing my PhD was empirical. And a lot of that is based on quantitative research. Like you need to have measures, you need to have things that you can quantify, that you can measure, you need to track progress. And so I think the instinct to be able to say, well, let's quantify kids' math skills and let's do things and see if we can get kids' math skills to get better by changing various teaching initiatives, I think is a good instinct. I think part of the issue is that in translation, it ends up being teaching towards a test. And we start to lose track that kids have different abilities and have different interests and have different ways of learning. And that being able to have those rote skills isn't the only thing that's important. I think the thing that I've internalized after having been in school for, my goodness, many, 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 many years is that the most valuable thing I learned in school were not, in fact, the facts that I learned, but was rather how to learn, how to approach these questions, to be curious, to be interested, to be able to look up and research and answer and critically analyze texts and research that's presented. And honestly, I think that's one thing, particularly in primary and second school, that is really lacking for kids. And the emphasis tends to be much more on shoveling facts into their heads so they can do well on tests, and much less so on being curious, on being interested, on being hardworking, on grit and perseverance.
I would add just one more thing to that, if I may, along that theme, Samantha, is that, because I would agree with you, not all students are able to express their understanding through tests that test for rote facts and memorization, but there's not enough engagement with children in the process, not just learning how to learn, but in the process of how things are done. Experiential learning that involves more of doing things with your two hands. Experiments to discover how things work in math, or learning from insects, learning from biology, from the natural world.
And to follow up on that, I think it's one thing that ends up bringing a lot of kids into my office, frankly, and is one of the reasons that we have such high ADHD diagnoses in this generation and increasingly, is that a lot of the emphasis at school is to sit down, be quiet, pay attention, stare at the board, listen to the teacher, take notes. And these are things that are not natural for most kids in terms of how they learn, in terms of how they approach problems. And for certain kids, it's really, really difficult for them to be able to adjust to it. I think we're not doing any services to our kids when we're really trying to encourage them to be in this very, very sedentary environment, to sit, be quiet, pay attention, and have facts shoveled into their heads.
I also think that what the structure that you just described, Samantha, they say, right, disadvantages boys more than girls, right? This is the what people are, much fuss is made out of this. I do kind of feel that critique applies to my experience. I mean, I found that I was very disengaged with the structure of the classroom setting when I was in primary school and then in secondary school. I found that experiential, things that were more hands-on, whether it was certain types of projects you'd have to work in more closely with other people or with the teacher, to have to do things that were less sit down and regurgitate facts, and they're a bit more dry. I found I identified, I excelled more. I also found that, to me, looking back on it, so much it was personality based. I know that's part of like sort of the magic chemistry of good teachers. You know, there are some subjects that, you know, as I grew older and became more independent in my education, that I love those subjects, but there were some subjects that I had a history class. I love history, but I just really didn't like the teacher, and so I was completely turned off, right?
It's interesting that you say that, because if I think of, my experience in high school, we had one year where we had economics class, I think in grade 10 or 11, and our teacher at the beginning was really, really very lovely, very, very nice lady, teaching very much from the book. I think we were all bored to tears and found it tedious and terrible. And then partway through, she went on mat leave, and we had Mr. Sears, who replaced her. And he was passionate and excited about what he was teaching. And all of a sudden, economics, which was something that isn't inherently interesting to me, it's not something that's inherently easy to me either, all of a sudden we just fed off his passion and his interest. And I think that's part of it, is where we're touching on, yes, there's the magic of the teacher and that relationship, and there's also just instilling curiosity, passion, asking questions, that even something that may seem like a really dry subject, if you have someone who's can really encourage you to want to know more, to ask those questions, I think can be extremely valuable in a learning experience.
Well, I certainly think that one of the failings in our system, and I don't know how to redress it short of conscription, is that there's just not enough male role models for little boys from nursery school on, whether children are in daycare or preschool, primary school, secondary. It's not before CEGEP or university that you start to see a number of male teachers and professors. And this is a trend that has gone worse with time. Let's remember the father of my children was a high school math teacher and a truly gifted and devoted teacher of math to high school students, and he had that gift of making a very difficult subject come alive, mostly because a lot of his problems involved all kinds of funny examples, like if 3 mafiosi have to buy 6 machine guns to execute a contract. And, he always had very, very funny word problems, and the kids really related to that and enjoyed his math worksheets and worked very, very hard for them. And he also showed a lot of respect for them. But boys in particular need that male presence. We're not amoebae, where there's just the mommy amoeba and the daughter amoeba. We're humans. We reproduce with a mom and a dad, I shouldn't really just restrict it to boys, but it is because, as Daniel points out, and I agree with him, it's often easier for girls to sit down and well-behaved, mostly because that's how we're socialized from infancy, to sit down and be good little girls, and boys, who are a little more rambunctious, not only need more experiential learning where they can burn some of that energy and be doing things to acquire knowledge as opposed to just reading what's up on a chalkboard. In addition, having a man who understands their energy needs can permit them to flourish. And I think it's a terrible social crisis in Quebec that's terribly neglected. We have a common core curriculum, like in the States. We call it the régime pédagogique, the pedagogical curriculum, a standardized curriculum across the province to ensure that children are getting that basic core education, for better or for worse. I always worry it doesn't leave enough room for creativity. But notwithstanding that, we're not really doing anything to redress the fact that the majority of white Christian boys born in the province of Quebec do not make it through high school in the 7 years that Statistics Quebec accords to high school. In other words, you don't have to finish high school by 17. I think you have to finish it by 19 or 20 at the outset if you have a missed year, or you have to repeat a year or something. And it's over 50% of boys that are failing high school. What does that say in a world where more and more people are required to have a university degree just to have a clerical job, not even a professional job?
Well, and it's, you make a very interesting point when you get into having more men involved in the traditional kind of caregiving roles, and particularly when it comes to, early childhood education and primary and secondary school, or elementary and high school. It's a really interesting point. And, I'd like to build on the having more hands-on learning. There is evidence, at least in very, very early education, that kids do learn much better by being outside more, by play-based learning, by taking, in fact, extra recess, by having an extra recess period so they can move around, wiggle out the crazies, and kind of burn off some energy and be able to come in and focus a little bit more. So I think it's being able to respect their developmental periods, their developmental age more, and how kids typically learn, which is by trying things out, by things being fun, interesting, engaging, by doing a lot of hands-on learning. I think that would really benefit boys, also, frankly, girls as well. And I think even as we're adding, and maybe for the older kids, it would be, for the younger kids, it's really instilling. The thing that gets me, and let's get to this, is that if I think of myself as a child, and I think of
you are a child to me.
Yeah. Well, and I think of my daughter Eva, who's 5, who started kindergarten, and I think of when I was little, I was really curious and interested in a lot of things, and I asked a lot of questions. And when I think of Eva, she loves learning. She's really passionate about this stuff. Like, she'll ask all sorts of questions about politics and about history and about science and about space. And the thing that worries me is what my experience was in elementary school and in high school was that it kind of killed my passion. I wasn't curious. I wasn't interested. I saw school very functionally. My job is to go there, sit down, be quiet, get good grades. And I think that it would benefit for all kids to be able to have much stronger emphasis on them having on really instilling interest and curiosity. And that needs to be a really pivotal skill, frankly, that's taught in schools. But honestly, Daniel, I'm really curious about what your input is, because as the token male in the family, well, of my generation at least, I just want to know, like, what do you think? What do you think would have helped you out when you were in school to have been more engaged and interested?
When I look back on it, I guess maybe something intrinsically male, but I wanted more just immediate results. Like, I never fully understood. It could never be fully explained to me why I needed to be studying any of these things and what the relevance was. Having to sit in a class and being told that you have to get good marks in this because people, like adults, appreciate that. I never fully understood why do I need to learn this math problem or this vocabulary test. Like, I never fully understood what the consequence of it was. There's nothing immediate about it. It's completely, I have to say, it just felt so far away.
So we should have given out cookies at the end of every test.
No, I think when I think of like positive experiences I had, really the only things that come up are close relationships that I made with teachers that I liked. Like, the relational aspect really meant a lot to me. When there was a teacher that who showed an interest in me and who I liked for one reason or another, that resonates in terms of like a maturation process and trying to like sort of absorb their values, their interests.
So you'd have had to have much smaller classes.
Yeah, that's something that does come to mind. And also in terms of experientials, I know it's not a scholastic endeavor, but in the summertime when I would go hiking with my dad, I also look back on that as something in terms of a developmental accelerant. Going out there and just learning basic skills, how to camp, and also how to have a bit more mental toughness to push through some things that might be unpleasant as a child. Those are things that really resonate with me. When I think back to actual like tests and everything, all I remember is like, it was just about avoiding pain. That's the only reason I was doing it. It was like, well, if I fail, like, my mom's going to yell at me, and my dad's going to be upset. But I know that their love is unconditional anyways. So.
Damn. We should have made love conditional on your grades.
But the other problem is that I knew how to be a ham. That was a whole other thing. That's just the strategies to sort of take resources away from the teacher, right? If you're hammy and you're articulate and you make a lot of jokes, you get the attention, and they're like, oh, you're a lovable rapscallion, and then
that was your reputation. It's with the emphasis on the rapscallion part, and lovable too. In fairness,
so you avoid those. You avoid a lot of the pain at report card time. Okay, it comes, then it passes, and then you make jokes.
It's true. Now that I think back on it, true. You didn't feel necessarily the authority of the school. Samantha, you felt that more. You were very focused on doing well in school.
I was always much more concerned with what adults thought of me and of being accepted by adults. And I was the, sit down, be quiet, don't make a lot of noise kid. That said, I still found school, elementary and high school in particular, an extremely unpleasant experience.
I think you did both find school ultimately pretty aversive. But you know what? I know a lot of bright children who were succeeding and doing well in school who still found it aversive. So
because the grades had nothing to do with it. And even the thing that I can echo in you, Daniel, is that I also didn't see the point of it. I didn't see why I was learning these things. I thought that they were largely irrelevant to me. I didn't see the point. I saw I was just much more compliant than you were. So it was just more like, okay, well, the adults say I have to do this thing, so I guess I'll sit down and do this thing, and it's important to me to get good grades, I guess. But I didn't have an intrinsic interest in what I was actually being taught. And I think that's a big problem. And honestly, when I have a lot of parents coming in with kids who are having difficulties in school, that is a big thing that the kids say is just, why am I doing this? What's the point of this? And I think that's a question that really merits a serious and thoughtful answer. I was having difficulty at the previous school that I was at, and my parents transferred me to Royal Vale, and my first teacher there in grade 2 was Monsieur Cyr, and I'd been doing terribly in French beforehand, and my grades when I was there went D, C, B, A. And a lot of that, it wasn't that I all of a sudden developed this passion for French and I thought it was just such a wonderful language and started studying so much more. I was the same kid. It was just that Monsieur Cyr took a special interest in me. Mm-hmm. And if I can echo what you were saying, Daniel, it was just having that relationship that I knew that he just took the extra time with me, that if I went to talk to him, if I was upset about something, that he would listen to me, that he would, weigh what I had to say seriously. If I said that a boy was bothering me in class, even if it was partly my fault, he would still get the other boy in trouble.
It's funny, thinking back on this, all the examples that came to mind were actually male teachers, which is funny because it kind of coheres with what you were alluding to earlier, Mom, about male role models for maybe for young boys being important. I think of, and the common element being that they all showed an interest in me. If, like you're saying, Samantha, I think in grade 3 there was a teacher, Marco Freticelli, I remember, and he was very much into writing. It was really like a writing sort of based English morning class. And he always showed a great interest in all the stuff that I was writing. It was just very encouraging. And I was writing like really dark, twisted, violent, like horror-themed stories at the time. And but he thought they were great. He was like, "You're a little Stephen King," and it was just like, and so it was encouraging. And then I think of not Monsieur Cyr, who was a great teacher, but who I really connected to is Mr. Sears. And
me too, Mr. Sears.
Right.
Yeah.
And I remember this was maybe in like grade, it might have been grade 8, and he was reading The Economist at his desk, and I think I was there for detention or something. And he said, this is great stuff, Daniel. You should read The Economist. It's like, cut above everybody else. Everyone else is a mental midget. Time, Newsweek. I mean, he's talking to me like I'm an adult. Like, what a thing to tell like a kid in 8th grade. And I felt so, flattered by that. And he was treating me like, I don't know, like a
human, like someone worthy of respect and interest. And he wasn't talking down to you.
Yeah. And then the last shout I'd have to give was to Mr. Wilkins, who is also an English.
Yeah, he was also great.
Yeah. And he had this kind of very dry sort of British sense of humor. And he used to kind of make these kind of these sort of you have these little put downs to certain kids in the class that would go over their head because they were just like very dry and kind of some puns that they wouldn't really capture, and he would kind of look at me and I would laugh, and so that sense of connection.
Yeah, and for me, and let me just add one more quick. Of course, I have to say Mr. Buckland, who was also somebody else, a teacher who took a really special interest, and that really, meant a lot to me at the time. I'd feel remiss not to mention him.
What about you, Mom?
Yeah, what about you, Mommy?
Yeah, who formed you?
Well, I think you're asking me for a single incident. You kids went further, but I would think in grade 7, Mr. Bolsjes, which is a Dutch name, and you can imagine what we children at that age did with that name, but I'll spare you. Yes, that's right. We called him Mr. B.
Yeah.
And I had blown up a photo of him to an 8x10 print and glued it to corrugated cardboard and put it up outside the classroom and had darts that I was distributing to other kids to take pot shots at him, but it was with great affection. And he was the big champion of projects. We had class projects every week, and I loved doing projects on Gregor Mendel, projects on Watson and Crick on the DNA helix. And I remember once when I wrote a short horror story for him, and I remember the words I used. I talked about this sound that was emanating from the boiler room, and this sense, and that I was fearful about it once, twice, thrice, and this strange sound was susurrating. I remember some of these words that I used at the time, and he was so blown away that he bought me as a gift the book Rasselas by Samuel Johnson, I believe. which I read. And he was the one, in fact, responsible for me going grade 5 to 7 and grade 7 to 9. Because I was originally in a mixed 6-7 class with him. And he placed me into grade 7 and let me go ahead, finish grade 7 curriculum. And then I was able to start high school, right in the middle of high school, in grade 9 at Sec 3, secondary 3, as we call it here in Quebec. And I would say, yeah, the teacher who was most interested in me and who took most of an interest and who let me work freely, who let me work beyond what the curriculum mandated so that I could go further. I could work at my own pace. Someone who taught it, which was by then prohibited in schools. You know that, eh? You were not allowed to work at your own pace. It was also, what else was prohibited? There was, you couldn't teach English grammar anymore. So you children never learned English grammar. It's totally prohibited here. It's a very strange province we live in. He taught English grammar anyway, and I'm the type of useless, well-behaved child who loved learning English grammar. Right?
English are hard.
Yeah, English are super hard. And I totally adored that. And then I think also in grade 10, Mr. Ginty. Hey, see, the boy teachers were the most important ones in English, where I was having a huge fight with him. And I started sitting in the back of the classroom, which if you know Anne France at all, you know is ridiculous because I'm somebody who sits under the nose of comedians at the Nasty Show, even though I know I'm going to get picked on. And I would sit in the back of the class. And I remember him announcing January midterm marks. And he was one of those English teachers who never gave anybody over a 75 or an 80. And he announced my mark at one point, and everybody was all hushed, like, oh, Mr. Ginty is going to be announcing Anne France's mark. And it was a 94.
And you thought, where'd the other 6% go?
Now you understand the problems I had in school. That's the problem when you're a perfectionist. But, you notice what all three of us reported with equal passion and interest and fondness.
It was a teacher that took a special interest in us.
Yeah, it's the relation. It's not really the subject matter, but rather the teacher who took the interest, who had the patience, who put in the time, and that's why that will never be replaced by computers, by the use of computers, by standardized education. Will never be. We're hairless monkeys. We need that relationship, and we need it from lady teachers, and we need it from male teachers, please. Father figures, mentors, role models. That's what's missing in our educational system
any
today.
adult, regardless of,
any
gender.
loving, caring adult, but all of us reported a number of male teachers who were, amongst others, of course, who were very significant in our lives.
I think that there's been a move in some Scandinavian countries, and I think there's been some experiments coming into North America with this as well, in terms of particularly in early education, something I was mentioning before, is having more play-based learning. So really, particularly for younger kids, we've spoken about red-shirting kids, so sort of delaying their school entry tends to dramatically reduce, or at least the evidence now suggests it dramatically reduces behavior problems for years and years thereafter, and sort of ADHD symptoms are what we traditionally associate with ADHD. Those symptoms tend to go down for years thereafter. And I think part of it is really, trying to get kids to learn more in nature, learn more by doing, learn more by playing, some of the Montessori influence, which again is really based on play learning and giving kids a chance to move up at their own kind of pace and have special relationships with their teachers. I think in terms of early childhood education, I think that that's something that's starting to perk up ears and I think is really important. That said, has it been taken up by and large? No, I think that, we've tended to stick with the same system. The biggest change over, if I think of from when I was a kid as, to my daughter starting kindergarten now, is that there's more technology in school now. But I'm not sure if that's necessarily a good thing. Technology is a tool. So it becomes, well, how is it learned? If it's going to be used to, how is it going to be used? And if it's going to be used to instill the same kind of, rote facts, I don't think that's great. It does give room to be able to tailor education to each individual kid, which I think is important. But if you notice what we were talking about before, when we spoke about our educational experiences, the things that inspired us the most, none of us mentioned topics. We all mentioned the relationship with the teacher. And so the influx of technology into school, I don't think is going to be as game-changing as people think it may be.
I do. I, on the other hand, do. I think that there's room for many different modalities of teaching. There are children that respond to different ways of doing things. Some prefer the doing to the reading. Others prefer what we call the more traditional system, which is more teacher directed. And I find when I've experienced different ways of doing things, each has its own benefits. I never liked team-based learning as a child, because I always found the people around me, let's be frank, too stupid. Which might have been my problem, might have been their problem.
Stupid kids, yeah.
Well, but when I got older, I remember doing a week-long program as a very young trial attorney, and we were put into fixed teams, and they deliberately mixed more star candidates with weaker candidates to see how that would work out. And it was very interesting to learn in an exercise, and I found it hugely enriching, and it stuck with me, is that no matter who you're working with, you're going to have something to learn. And the two of the best candidates, and I was one of them, who were deliberately paired in a bigger group with weaker candidates. We both agreed the weaker candidates, we'd let them plead and shine. And we got a lot of kudos and feedback. And we hadn't realized that we were maturing in that process, because we were recognizing that that the success in a team is the success of the team, and not just, insisting on having all the glory. So I think different modalities give children different things at different stages in life. But I do know one big difference that's coming, and it is that influx in technology. And there's two dangers. It encourages too much passive learning, not active learning.
Yes.
And it also creates a risk of not being able to distinguish valid material that you research if you're sitting with your little child with your iPad, and the garbage that's out there on the internet. And what I'm hoping is it's going to be serve as an impetus in schools to start teaching critical thinking a lot earlier. Before, critical thinking was a luxury form of education provided to the children of the rich and famous in the private schools, the boarding schools, the elite schools, and the ordinary Joe and Jane kids got that rote learning. Now it's going to be necessary for all children, because you don't go to a library anymore and reach for a book that actually has valid material in it. You now search with keywords on Google, and your top 10 searches may include 7 websites of absolute unscientific, anti-knowledge garbage. And you now have to learn at an ever younger age how to reject the garbage and recognize what is valid material.
And if I may just add in quickly, I totally agree with you in terms of I think it's always important, always been important, and continues to be important to teach kids critical thinking and logic and argument and propaganda skills as early as humanly possible. Teach them to be critical thinkers, ask them questions, get their input, encourage them to really evaluate information. Kids get really excited by that type of stuff and can get them really engaged in the material, and it's an important life skill. But I'm going to add one thing where I realized I wasn't fair in terms of the influx of technology in education, is that for kids, particularly where they don't have access to good teachers, or in poorer areas or in more rural areas, that I think that having that access to technology can really be a boon for some kids who otherwise wouldn't have access to those textbooks or to those teachers to be able to teach them those types of lessons. But Dale, I'm curious what you have to say.
It makes me think back when I was in school, and I could spend hours and hours and hours on a video game, right? And if you
days and days,
and if you wanted me to study or do any homework, it was like pulling teeth. I didn't want to do it at all. And I always wonder, wasn't there a way you can adapt the basic tech of what video games are offering to kids into learning, right? This is the whole gamification promise, right?
They've done this with bullying skills. Actually, I think in Finland they had a program for this that they've had quite a lot of success with, creating kind of a video game to teach kids how to recognize and deal with bullies.
Now, I'm not sure, obviously there are going to be limits on that. I mean, I don't know to what extent you can really gamify all sorts of things that kids have to learn in their Common Core as they grow up. But I often think that it might be more doable than people say. I mean, if you think about the user experience in something like Facebook, right, which billions over a billion people on the planet can get addicted to easily, right? I mean, if you had a UI that was just fun and easy and more intuitive, and you could unlock points and modules and all sorts of things, like really gamify your sort of RPG education avatar, I could see it being a lot more fun. I mean, I noticed...
Well, here's the danger, the caveat I put on the idea of RPG role-playing games, where you've got the character, because not everybody knows what RPG and Avatar are. If you're... I think mostly people under the age of 10 know that stuff. I do, because I know the dangers of game addiction from when I was a younger and more rebellious person. I think that you also have to avoid the gimmickification, to invent a word. You have to avoid trying to create gimmicks to teach children. If you want to do role playing, do role playing. You have kids in a class, they can role play. And kids are at the most creative stages in their lives. You can give a kid a hat or a stick, and he will be another character of another world, and he can engage in that role playing with his fellow students, and you can act out what happens when somebody says something hurtful to the other person. Part of the big complaint about social media and the danger of social media, and I see it amongst young people, even when they go to movies, they're neither talking to each other anymore. I used to be at the headache in going to a movie. In a theater, young people be talking to each other. They don't even talk to each other anymore. And they're certainly not watching the movie. They're all on their little phones, Facebooking and Instagramming and Tindering.
You mean young
away.
people at 50 years old who...
Are you making fun of your mother who has 2 phones? One for each aunt?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I am.
But also with information,
I'll take that like a man.
but with information being democratized on the web, I mean, even when I was
Information and disinformation.
well, first of all, I think the disinformation argument's a little overstated because I think that search results on Google have gotten much better in terms of assessing quality, in terms of cross linkages and all sorts of other built-in, baked-in elements of the algorithms. It's very rare that you're getting like sort of basement-style message boards on nonsense.
I'm talking about
Wikipedia. You'd always go to the footnotes in Wikipedia. There's amazing the quality control.
I think part of the idea is that you have to know to be able to check the footnotes and be able to check those links, and that is a skill in of itself. That I think that sometimes we forget that we have been in a lot of school.
I've spent days and days and days worth of my life on Wikipedia, and I think I've only ever come across like some misinformation, like hardly ever.
The problem that I have is this. The truth is, it's not the material that's always what's the most important element in that classroom environment, but rather the capability of the adult at the front of the classroom to communicate with those children, right? And it's the nature of the communication, the process, the ability to draw out the children. There are teachers who've taught. So I remember we had a substitute math teacher for a period of time. Teacher was sick, who really didn't know all that much math, and basically would ask all the questions to the children. Now that I'm 57 years old, maybe actually it was a sham that she didn't know all the math, but she certainly pretended very well not to know all the math and expected us to be teaching her the math. And the truth is, when I look back upon it, I was very irritated when it was happening. I was that type of irritable child. But when I look back upon it now, it was really clever. Because the fact was that we had to do the heavy lifting and the hard work. So it was her skill at getting us to speak and to volunteer and to participate in class that got us all learning the math. And she wasn't talking about the material. So much as I love community involvement, not everybody who's good at doing something, baking bread or sewing a dress or finding insect specimens to dissect under a microscope, not everybody who has these actual real-life skills is necessarily gifted at communicating them with children. But I do think that as early as in high school, children should have the opportunity to be mentored, perhaps even themselves going into work environments and seeing how things are done, and even being the little apprentices. We've moved away from that model. It used to be that children at a young age knew how to do things, not just the obvious like milk a cow or slop a pig or whatever the expressions are, but also knew how to build, how to construct things, how to cook, how to sew, how to have real world skills that have completely disappeared. I think the most important thing that we can do for the future of teaching is start to treat teachers with greater respect. I promise you, if you would invite more men into the profession, the profession would attract more respect. Any profession that is dominated by women attracts a lower salary. That is a universal truth. It's true even in Quebec, which is one of the most pro-women cultures on the earth. You need to get more men into the profession.
Well, how about...
You need to pay much better salaries. You need to accord teachers at all levels, from preschool, elementary school, high school, and on, much more respect. They have the future of our society in their hands, and you need to attract more of the best and the brightest. You need this, so they need social respect, economic respect, and a more integrated environment. And I think that that's what's the most important. The technology part, be damned. Kids learn the technology on their own.
Well, look, I always think there has to be some hybridity involved. I think there always has to be a place to absorb and learn the information through live discussion with other people, like in a seminar with a professor. I think that will always be important, no matter what our technological abilities are. But when in that space where tech can be an accelerant, I do think that there should be more, what I was referring to earlier, what I envision. I mean, the devil might be in the details, but something that might be, again, a bit more gamified, where you could have a sort of what I look back on my early education, what I really hated, it was not being able to choose my own education, what I was learning, right? Having to learn things that I just had no connection with, and I just was not incentivized. If I were able at that time to maybe start choosing certain modules in some easy-to-use interface and be like, okay, and there'd be a step-by-step process to it. Be like, okay, here's step 1 of this module, then step 2 is the seminar to discuss it. Okay, you've achieved that, you've got so many experience points, and put some nice bells and whistles on it to make it like more fun for a boy that wants to be more stimulated by a video game like experience. I could see that being very helpful.
I agree with both of you, actually. Like, I think that Mom, to your point, I think that teachers, also nurses, I think are extremely undervalued in our society and really could use a serious pay hike and a lot more respect and consideration. And I think that that's really important because they do play a really, really valuable, important role. And to what you're saying, Daniel, and I think that that's a really important shift for education, particularly here. I think also in terms of teaching more pivotal skills, like the facts are great, but also to encourage curiosity, grit, perseverance, critical thinking. I think those are, and teamwork. I think those are all really important critical skills that should be embedded in each of the curricula, and in terms of how teachers are teaching kids. And to touch on what you're saying, Dale, in terms of technology, I see technology as a tool. Like, I don't think it's going to replace. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a game changer. But I think that there's ways that we can engage kids more through using the things that they're already interested in. And honestly, when I'm working with kids, one of the number one things that I want to find out is, what do they like? What do they care about? And how do we import those interests into the things that they find more challenging so that they can be more engaged and they can be more stimulated? And if that means gamifying things, if it means giving them choice, if it means teaching them coding, like create your own video game, I think those are all extremely valuable. And maybe the future of education, particularly for elementary and high school, or primary and secondary school, is going to be in terms of having some level of independent learning that may be more technology assisted, and then coming back to check with the teacher and with the team to be able to problem solve, incorporate, and kind of, and consolidate and kind of figure that out. So coming up with a bit more of a hybrid model.
May I dedicate this episode to the father of those children, Chaim Adler, who's got to be one of the most gifted teachers, if not the most gifted teacher I've ever known, and had the toughest job in the world, respecting and teaching and educating high school students, which he did for over 30 years.
Yay, Daddy.
Yay,
who also helped me out in math when I was in high school and I was going through a rough period, and a rough period with the teacher at the school. And he took on my math education, and he made it interesting, and he made, and he was, besides just being Daddy, and I love Daddy, he's really a talented teacher, and he really instills a lot of interest and curiosity, and has a lot of patience.
Dr. Samantha, so going forward, as we were mentioning, what do you think are going to be the most important changes in teaching coming up, and what will stay the same?
Honestly, I think education is going to stay largely unchanged. It's been largely unchanged for generations and generations. There's been a lot more, in the States, charter schools and alternative schools here that have been taking off. But I'm not sure if they've become en rigueur or if they're going to affect the overall way schooling is done. That said, one thing I think for sure that's going to be incorporated much more is technology. It's just the direction that we're going in. Do I think that that's the best idea? Well, time will tell.
And finally, Dr. Samantha, further reading, what would you recommend on the topic of education and learning?
The article I'd like to suggest is called Virtues of Uncertainty by Guy Claxton. You can find it on aeon.co, aeon.co. And what it really talks about, which I found was interesting, was how to shift away from some of the rote learning or teaching towards the tests that's been the direction that education has been going in recently. And what are some of the core character traits and values that we can and should be encouraging in kids to really be able to best benefit them going forward in their lives and in terms of their education. So I think it's really worth a read.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Samantha.
Thanks, Dan.
And that'll do it for the Goldwaters this week. Don't forget you can catch up with past episodes at thegoldwaters.ca. You can join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter, hashtagging the Goldwaters. And we'd like to hear directly from you. Drop us an email, talk@thegoldwaters.ca. Tell us what you think about today's show and what you'd like to hear from us. For the Goldwaters, I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar. Until next time. Excellent. Thank you.
This has been a production of TNKR Media. Good talk.